Welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. Black Friday is an amazing time to build a gaming PC. With huge discounts on everything from GPUs to motherboards to CPUs and more, we get tons and tons of questions from confused PC builders. What's the best CPU and GPU combo? What GPU do they need for 1440p gaming? What kind of motherboard are they looking for? So what we've done is we've scoured all of our videos and Q&As for the past year and gotten all that relevant info into one video right here. And I'm going to update some of the specific sections with current advice. If you get value out of this video, give it a like, and with that, let's jump into it. This video is sponsored by VIP SCD Key. Say goodbye to crazy expensive Windows licenses and that terrible Activate Windows watermark. Right now, use the links in the video description, head over to VIP SCD Key and get a Windows 10 or 11 OEM license for a great price. Pick your product license, then use the PC Builder discount code PC25 for an additional 25% off. Go to the activation settings on your PC, put in the code, and boom! Windows is fully licensed for a crazy low price. And Windows 10 can be upgraded for free to Windows 11. And they have Microsoft Office licenses too. Use the links in the video description. We've got Annan. Annan asks, what's the minimum GPU from both teams? I guess we're just gonna ignore Intel out there. We're just gonna go NVIDIA versus AMD. That you would go with in order to achieve solid 1440p gaming performance, 120 plus frames. Well, obviously we're talking about the best 1440p graphics card in 2024. And I'm just gonna stop right here because what do we mean by 120 plus frames? 120 frames is easy to achieve in a game like CS2 on balanced or competitive settings. You can get that with like a potato these days. But if you want to get 120 plus frames with Cyberpunk 2077 or Alan Wake 2, first of all, I don't think you can do it with Alan Wake 2, at ultra settings. So let's start off, let's talk about for single player titles, then we'll get to the competitive shooting. Because single player titles right now, the benchmarks are pretty clear. Across a wide suite of harder to run single player titles at ultra settings, you're looking for a 7900 XT 20 gigabyte GPU or the RTX 4070 Ti Super. Yes, those are super powerful GPUs. That's what you need to play those kind of titles on a higher refresh rate monitor at ultra settings. Now you can do a couple things. Number one, and what I would recommend, turn the settings down to high. I've said for a while, it doesn't make much sense to play at ultra. It's one thing to test the GPUs at ultra to kind of get a worst case scenario. Oftentimes turning the settings down to just high settings will make a huge difference in your FPS. And a lot of times I don't see almost any difference in the visuals. That's why I recommend playing on high, even though we test at ultra. Of course, a lot of you just want to focus on those competitive multiplayer titles, getting 120 FPS at more balanced settings. So you're going to go low settings so you can push as many frames as you want. And honestly, the good news here is that VRAM is not as much of an issue, although if you ever do want to play those single player titles at 1440p, VRAM is an issue, so I would recommend at least considering that in the overall equation. Future Jason here, I'm going to switch up my recommendations for a 60 FPS at 1440p across all titles recommendation. Some of the GPUs I had been recommending earlier in the year, like the 6700 XT, 6750 XT, relatively sold out at this point. The good values right now, I would say at the cheapest RTX 3060 12 gigabyte, hang around $280. It's not a bad choice, about 58 to 60 average FPS there. But if you do want to move up for only about $30 more, at least right now, hopefully some discounts will happen during Black Friday, the 7600 XT, and right now as I'm filming this with two free games for about $310. But really the insane value is the 7700 XT 12 gigabyte GPU for $349. And with those two free games right now, that continues to be an insane value. Those are the kind of minimum points of entry for the best 1440p GPU if you're looking for it in 2024. Jay Brinks and Komodo basically have very similar questions in terms of CPU and GPU bottlenecks. Jay Brink says, with such strong GPUs in demanding games, CPU bottlenecks are becoming more common. Are they? Are they? We'll talk about that. And these are harder to alleviate with resolution or game settings. Yeah, because when you do run in that CPU bottleneck, basically, even if you turn the settings down, it's not going to help you because now you're generating even more frames and the CPU is still your bottleneck, right? So typically you want to turn the settings up instead. What GPU or other software technologies can come to lighten CPU demands. And then basically with CPUs, what matters more for gaming, the cores and thread count or the clock speed? Well, really neither. Honestly, neither. Let's talk a little bit about why we get bottlenecks. We get bottlenecks when the GPU is generating, CPU bottlenecks in particular, when the GPU is generating so many frames and the CPU just can't keep up with it. So then basically the CPU becomes kind of a wall. And the GPU is throwing a lot of frames, but it can't get them all out. So we can do one of two things at this point. We can either try and make the CPU go faster, we can try and overclock it, we can get faster memory for it, or we can turn up the GPU settings. So instead of maybe 1080p, medium settings, now we're going 1440p at ultra settings, and now the GPU is throwing fewer frames at us, but the game looks a lot better. It looks a lot better. So our experience of the game massively increased there, as long as the GPU can continue to support that resolution. Then the question is, like, how do we fix the CPU portion of it? If we had gotten like an 8-core CPU instead of a 6-core CPU, like say a Ryzen 5700X or 7700X instead of a 7600, would that have massively increased our performance? And what we find is not really. So let me give you a good example. For instance, Ryzen 3600, Ryzen 3700X, similar amounts of cache on them. And if you look at them in gaming, you can do the same thing with the 5600X and the 5700X. You can do essentially the same thing with the 7600X and the 7700X. Not a lot of performance difference between the two. Now, can you notice the difference? Yeah, you can measure it in terms of FPS, but then what would have gotten you even more performance is adding more cache. So for instance, if you throw a 5800X 3D in there next to a 5800X, that gives you way more performance because it's got all that V cache on it. So it really ended up being about cache. Now, in between generations, you've got way higher IPC. You've got a lot of other things going on that increase the performance of that CPU. There's die shrink. You can get way more performance out of the same amount of power, so you can even crank it higher. There's all kinds of things to go into it. But in the same generation, I wouldn't go for more cores. You want more cache in order to alleviate that CPU bottleneck. Let's jump into some GPU questions, including, is your GPU going to hold up under the new games that are coming down the pike? That's what Real Nazal wants to ask. Should they be concerned about modern GPUs underperforming in Unreal Engine 5 games? Benchmark shows the RTX 40 and RX 7000 series GPUs running Unreal Engine 5 games at about half the frame rate as other game engines. 4070 can't do 50 FPS at 1440p. The 4090 can't do 60 FPS at 4K. Considering how popular Unreal Engine 5 is among developers and all the games that are coming down the pike for it, they're worried that they're going to have to upgrade their GPU sooner than planned. What do we think about that? All right, what is Unreal Engine 5? It's a game development engine that's risen to popularity. It's relatively new, but we are seeing a lot of games scheduled to come out and some new games right now that just came out. We'll talk about that in just a second, that allow the development of these super photorealistic, high graphical fidelity games out there much easier than they would have done in the past. But just because game developers can develop these games better doesn't mean it's easier for your GPU to render that stuff, right? So what we're seeing is games that are coming out right now in Unreal Engine 5 are super hard on your GPU. Of course, the game that you're talking about is Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, and Tech Power Up did a whole benchmark of it. I just looked at it the other day. Yes, in fact, an RTX 4090 gets 57 average FPS. 57 average FPS. I had to just look it up because I was like, oh my gosh. And that sounds insane, right? Anybody out there with a 4K gaming monitor, you have to have a 4090 to run this. That's really going to shrink down your pool of available gamers out there. And honestly, just looking at their sales numbers, look like it hasn't done very well. That could be one reason, because a lot of people did make a big deal about the system recommendations. They're recommending an RTX 3080 or an RX 6800 XT. That's like a $500+ GPU level just to play the game at the recommended settings, which is totally insane, right? So yes, I think a couple things. Number one, we're going to see continued optimizations, both by the game developers before they launch. That would have really helped here. Number two, by AMD, NVIDIA, to some extent Intel, in order that their GPU architectures are supporting Unreal Engine 5. And we've already seen a little bit of this by AMD's made some noise, as so has NVIDIA on it. We're also going to get additional optimizations, I believe, in Unreal Engine 5 itself. The developers of UE5 are going to continue to tweak things as well. But even with all those optimizations, are you going to have to buy a bigger GPU to play these games? Yes, you probably will. The same way that if you want to play a lot of these games, you're having to buy a GPU with more VRAM right now, you're also going to need a faster GPU as well. All right, Shortworth asked a great question. How big of a performance uplift do you want to see in a CPU before getting an upgrade? And then also, why don't we ever see CPU benchmarks in grand strategy titles? We do see them, Gamers Nexus does them, but they tend to be more turn time based. So you want to reduce the turn time Not as exciting, I think, as the FPS stuff, and also a little bit harder to do because you really have to record when the turn is done and then how much segment of time that actually took. There's a lot involved there. So I certainly understand reviewers not wanting to dump in a lot of time because FPS is typically the numbers that really drive the clicks out there, right? But your first question is huge. How big a performance uplift do you need in a CPU? And I think these next two questions really kind of flesh it out. So Walt Dem and Cavi 429, they both have kind of gaming systems with a Ryzen 5000 processor, both have a 5600. One of them went from a Radeon 6600 to a Radeon 6900 XT. That's a huge upgrade, obviously. And then the other one has a 6800 XT. Wondering, should they go to the X3D CPU? So this is kind of when do you think about upgrading your CPU? To me, both those could probably use an upgrade to the CPU. The Ryzen 5600 tends to start bottlenecking right around the 7800 XT or like the RTX 4070. And when you see these benchmarks of GPUs out there, they're typically using the fastest available gaming CPUs, which either the 14900K, 13900K, or like a Ryzen 7800 X3D, and there's no CPU bottleneck there. But if you drop in some of these GPUs to like a Ryzen 5600X or a 3600X or a 2600X, right, or a 1700X, or even go back or like an 8600K, yeah, you're gonna see those CPU bottlenecks hit a lot sooner, and you're not gonna get the uplift you want. So then when should you think about upgrading? Number one, if you're on an Intel platform, and it's not 12, 13, 14 gen, it's probably going to require an entire platform upgrade. So maybe the calculus for you is a little bit different because you'll need a new motherboard. You probably also want to get more RAM because you probably want to go to DDR5, like a Ryzen 7000 system. But for those of you on AM4 out there, I think the 5800 X3D and the 5700 X3D, the 5700 X3D literally just hit $199. It's an insane value. I still want to see that you have a faster GPU. You don't want to upgrade a 5600 with a slow GPU to a 5700 X3D. You won't get any more FPS because at 5600, you're already getting all the FPS out of your GPU. So I want to see a bigger end GPU, like I like the 6800 XT kind of and higher possibly, RTX 4070 and higher kind of GPUs out there. Then I would certainly drop in a 5700 X3D. All right, Makula asks, what motherboard necessities do I recommend for first-time builders that they have on their motherboards? As a first-time builder, they felt like they wanted to spend more for all the bells and whistles to limit the work for themselves, like buying additional Wi-Fi and audio cards, but they don't want to waste money on one that has too many features because they have a budget 1440p build. They feel super confused. What do I recommend? Well, first I would say motherboards are super confusing. They are super confusing. That's why we started doing our motherboard buying guides a couple years ago, and they have been one of the more popular pieces of content on the channel as a result, because we go through like what are all the various features on the motherboard that you need to think about when you're buying it, and what ones should you be focused on. And then we break them down into categories in terms of budget, in terms of mid-range, and in terms of the more premium boards. I think that first-time builders can fall into one of two camps too often, which is either they want to buy the super ultra expensive board that has all the bells and whistles on it because they're fear of missing out basically of some kind of minor feature, or they go the opposite direction. They're looking for the super cut down garbage board out there that they can get away with so they can invest all their money in their CPU and GPU. And I know this is one of these, like, not too much that way, not too much this way, the just right approach. I would recommend the just right approach, right? It's the Goldilocks approach. Not too hot, not too cold. We want more the mid-range boards are typically what you're looking for. So for instance, let's talk about the B650 motherboards. You can get super expensive motherboards. This is one of them. This is like $250 motherboard. This is the Asus B650E-F Wi-Fi on it. And it's a great board, but I needed a lot of these features. I needed a lot of the higher end stuff because you're looking at what's processing all the video right here. So this was kind of a need on my behalf. For most gamers, however, this board is totally overkill. Now you can do it. If you've got a big budget, maybe this isn't such an expense. Otherwise, I would recommend taking a look at a lot of boards out there. On the more budget side for B650 motherboards, that's socket AM5, I really like the ProRS Wi-Fi here. This is by an ASRock board. Maybe you don't like ASRock though, so consider, for instance, the MSI B650M-A Pro, another great board. And it has just kind of the basic features on it. It's got good enough audio on it, kind of more entry-level audio. Got good enough VRAMs on it to run any of the CPUs out there or the CPU that you're looking for. It's got a number of M.2 slots on it, which is great. And it's got a pretty good rear I/O section on it. So those are the things that I would really focus on. All right, Pepe asks, what are the benefits of the higher end motherboards then? So we just talked about getting a mid-range board. Why would you jump up to a board like this? Typically, you have more USB ports and they're higher speed USB ports than you get on the lower end boards. You also get more M.2 slots and they tend to be higher speed than they are on the lower end boards, or they're full speed ports as opposed to half speed ports, because this board here, while it has three M.2s, one of them is basically like half speed. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is fan RGB headers, RGB on the board itself. You talk about the VRMs itself. That being said, a board like this, this is good enough to run a 7950X. So then, do you really need the VRMs on this board? Yes, they run cooler, but as long as they run within acceptable temperatures, it's almost like a who cares? Like, do you want to spend extra money to take the VRM temperature down a little bit if it doesn't matter, if they're both within acceptable limits? It's really hard to say. That's pretty much the major differentiator. Other than RAM speed, where it might be easier to clock up faster RAM on a board like this that probably has better traces because it's more expensive than a board like that. But you can still clock up DDR5 6000 CL30 memory really easily on this one. So again, it's getting harder and harder to differentiate. All right, Sven's calling me out. He's saying his question is, why do I keep recommending AMD GPUs for non-budget builds when FSR is vastly inferior to DLSS? Vastly inferior to DLSS according to Sven. And Sven, thank you very much for submitting the question. We do get this quite a lot, so that's why I picked this one out. I definitely want to respond to it. Am I wrong for recommending AMD GPUs over their NVIDIA counterparts, both in this generation and in previous generations as well? I don't think so. First of all, I challenge that FSR is vastly inferior to DLSS. Frankly, I use both the technologies. I have two different PCs, one with RTX 4090 and this one with a 7900 XT, and I played both of them on the same exact Gigabyte M28U monitor, and I played similar games, and I used DLSS on the one out in the front room, and in here in the studio, I used FSR, obviously with the AMD GPU, because you can't use DLSS. And I don't notice the difference even at 4K. And I would say, I don't think even the people who test this stuff on Hardware Unboxed has done some fantastic testing. I don't disagree with their testing, by the way. I want to be very, very clear about this. I disagree with people taking their testing and then making these kinds of statements about them, right? Taking other people's data and making those kind of statements. In my experience, they are more or less the same. The differences between them are extremely minor. It's stuff that you have to pause a video, pause a game as you're playing it, and then zoom in 200 to 300% to see that the difference in the detail. And if you do that, you can see that DLSS is technically superior to FSR. But would anyone actually be able to tell the difference if I set up two different stations, like the Linus Tech Tips did this a while back with SSDs? They had a Gen 4, a Gen 3, and a SATA SSD. And a lot of people pick the SATA SSD as the fastest feeling one out of those, even though it's clearly not the fastest. So I think if you did the same thing with FSR, XESS, and DLSS on similar games at 4K, you'd have people saying, oh no, this is the best, but it's just down to their perception. And I feel like at this point, they are close enough that most gamers would not really be able to tell the difference between the two of them. So then it comes down to, why am I recommending AMD GPUs? Simply because they offer significantly more performance for your dollar, significantly more performance. In fact, to the point where you can render these games, if you had a certain amount of money to spend on an AMD and NVIDIA GPU, the AMD GPU that you will get will give you so many more frames that you could just do native. You don't even need upscaling a lot of times to match DLSS output on the NVIDIA GPU. That's how crazy the price to performance has become. And on top of that, we've got VRAM, right? NVIDIA has been so stingy with the VRAM. Would you rather have right now an RTX 3080 10 gigabyte GPU that you probably spent like $2,000 for during the height of the craziness, the GPU shortage, or would you rather have an RX 6800 XT or 6950 XT? Usually the 6950 XT sold for actually even a little bit below or right around the same price as the RTX 3080. Which one of those would you rather have? Well, obviously you'd rather have the Radeon GPUs with significantly more VRAM, right? 16 gigs instead of 10 gigs of VRAM. It's even worse if you go down one more card to like the 3070, where you had 8 gigs of VRAM and it was like the same price most of the time as the 6800 XT with 16 gigabytes. So not only is the 6800 XT way faster, it's got 16 gigs of VRAM versus 8. And that 3070 today, if you bought one like I did when our channel was kind of not even really that big at the time, so I was just really an ordinary person buying the 3070 basic on name recognition on NVIDIA, 8 gigs of VRAM, I feel like I made a huge mistake. I should have gotten a 6800 XT for about the same price at the time. And if you look at our current generation of GPUs, under $600, where do you go for an NVIDIA GPU that has similar performance? I'd also say I base a lot of this stuff not necessarily on what I want or I would recommend, but also on what you want, audience. So we do a lot of polling here in our community tab. This is a poll we did a couple of months ago. When buying a new GPU for gaming, what was the number one most important thing to them? 17,000 votes out there. I don't think that's a small amount to take a poll. 17,000 people voted. And number one just absolutely destroyed everything else. Most raw FPS for my budget. 88% said that. 88%. Only 3% said best ray tracing. Only 4% said ability to use DLSS on NVIDIA. Only 2% said ability to use frame generation, and 3% said something else. 88% of you want the most raw FPS for your budget. So then I did a follow-up poll basically. Okay, I get it. Most raw FPS, number one. But what's number two? What's the number two most important thing out there? And 74% of you said getting the most VRAM for your budget, basically for the amount you're spending on your card. Only 9% said getting an NVIDIA GPU for DLSS upscaling. Remember, this is not the top. This is for the second. This is for the second feature. Only 9% said even that for the second feature. And then 6% said aesthetic color options like color options, RGB, no RGB. Ability to do a high-end ray tracing and path tracing was only 6%. So again, this is on the second feature. Number one feature, overwhelmingly FPS. Number two feature, overwhelmingly VRAM. Well, what cards kind of answer that call, if you will, right now? Primarily, they're AMD GPUs outside of the RTX 4070 Ti Super, which we have been recommending, especially if you want to do high-end ray tracing and you want to get the card that's the best value for it because it's got 16 gigs of VRAM and it has pretty dang good ray tracing performance out there. But you can see ray tracing is not a huge percent. And this is not, again, 17,000 people voted in this poll as well. So just kind of highlighting, I just decided to pull up some stats here, just highlighting this is more in the mid-range. This is the TechSpot RX 7600 XT review. This is 1440p performance data, 12 game average. They usually use relatively hard to run, more single player titles out there. So when you do those like non-single player titles, you know, multiplayer shooters and stuff like that, you get tons and tons more FPS. And this is ultra settings. And again, I recommend playing games on high rather than ultra. That way you get more FPS because it's usually not worth the FPS hit. If you want to spend like anywhere from $300 to $450, what GPU you gonna get right now? For $380, you can get the 7700 XT, 92 average FPS, 12 gigs of VRAM. What do you get for $400 from NVIDIA? RTX 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte GPU. 8 gigabyte GPU that's going to give you 79 average FPS, but look at those 1% lows. And that's because some of the titles, they're running out of VRAM basically. So the 1% lows are awful at 55%. And this is 55 FPS rather. And this is, again, this is a 12 game average. So there are some titles in there where VRAM doesn't make a difference. And that's kind of probably propping up that card. But how long do you expect that card to be relevant for? But switching over to more high-end GPUs, because I know you said outside of budget, and I don't know what you consider budget. I wouldn't consider dropping $400 on a GPU necessarily budget out there, right? But let's push that up a little bit. So this is the Tech Power Up Sapphire RX 7900 GRE review. So again, relatively recent data, 1440p. This is average FPS. I think that's like a 23 game average out there. And again, mostly harder to run, single player titles, and I believe ultra details out there. Right now you can get two different GPUs with relatively the same performance. That's the RTX 4070 Super at 118 average FPS or the RX 7900 GRE with 119 average FPS. One of those GPUs has 12 gigs of VRAM. One of those GPUs has 16 gigs of VRAM. Which of those GPUs do you think is going to be relevant for longer? And I'm just going to tell you right now, I wouldn't be buying a GPU over $400, I should say, with less than 16 gigs of VRAM. I just absolutely would not do it right now. And that's why I backed away from the RTX 4070 Super and 4070 the way I have increasingly, especially as we get more and more evidence that 12 gigs is not going to be enough for ray tracing workloads. Ray tracing, remember, ray tracing, DLSS, frame generation, what do they all do? They all increase VRAM usage. And what is the thing that's really constraining these NVIDIA GPUs? It's VRAM, especially given the fact that, again, at least in my estimation, the difference between FSR and DLSS is very minor, but the difference between 16 gigs of VRAM and 12 gigs of VRAM is likely to be very, very major in the future, especially when NVIDIA rests a lot of its laurels on ray tracing right now, which, again, testing has shown that you really need like 16 gigs of VRAM in order to ray trace at 1440p, and I would just recommend going up in resolution, instead getting those better looking textures or higher quality textures instead of adding the ray tracing in. That's going to improve your gameplay. Cleo asks, how do I get such good shots of Mr. Bear? They have a hard time getting similar photos. Mr. Bear absolutely loves the camera. He preens for the camera. He seems to always know where that camera is. And he does stuff like this just all the time. We have another cat. Her name is Xena. She hates the camera. She hides from the camera. It's almost like they know. She knows it's something to be avoided, and he absolutely loves it. Our Los Angeles Kings, I like that one, by the way, asked, hey, Jason, when is the cat getting a raise? This guy, he has already gotten a raise. He gets paid in treats, basically. Anti-Charlie, can we make a video or some sort of vlog talking about your cat? If not, at least put him in your videos more often. Oh my gosh, how much more Mr. Bear do you want? He's like in literally every video. Every now and then, he decides he doesn't want to hang out with Dad. But normally, he won't get more than like 2 feet from me. This is as far away as he wants to be. There's a whole reason for that. Maybe I will do a vlog, kind of explain more of the backstory. Roberto asks, how old is the cat? I believe he is now almost 10 years old. He's coming up on his 10th birthday. We've had him since he was just over a year old. The person who had Ambrosius here, AKA Mr. Bear, just couldn't deal with it. He was traveling a lot, and he decided he was either going to give the cat up for adoption or take it to like the SPCA or something. So we had the cat over, and the first thing he did when he got there is like literally jumped into my lap and said, you know, Dad, basically. That was it. We kept him ever since then. And he's a super huge snuggler and just never wants to get too far away from me. Watch this though, because the feeder's gonna go off any second now. Oh, there it went. What? Oh, he scrambled out. Okay, careful, Mr. Bear. Says, how does Mr. Bear feel about sharing the spotlight with 2 new junior associates? So if you didn't know, unfortunately, our kitty Xena passed away in January. We did a whole post on it. I tried to film a video explaining it, but I just couldn't do it. It was just too raw. But I can say now that she passed away. We loved her a lot. And at the same time, now we're down to the one cat, Mr. Bear, and you know, he definitely missed her, and we missed her, and we wanted to get a couple of new kitties. So we went out to a local shelter here, Animal Rescue New Orleans, that does a great job, and we adopted Lisa and Waffles. Anytime you introduce cats, you got to know there's always some hissing and batting. Mr. Bear, we've been pleasantly surprised how much I don't want to say he's adopted them yet because we're not there yet, but how well he has done taking them on, because Mr. Bear is 10 years old. He just turned 10 years old. So imagine he's a little bit of a senior cat now and been with the same playmate for 7 years, and then suddenly she's gone, and now he's got these 2 new cats and he doesn't know what's going on anymore. He's been doing super well. We're really encouraged by it. And the kittens are just a lot of fun. In particular, Lisa has taken over video editing duties and is sitting with my wife most of the time doing the video editing. So Mr. Bear doesn't have to worry about that anymore. If you got value out of this video, please give it a like. It makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe for more cool PC content like our monthly GPU market update. We take a look every month at the GPU market and tell you what's the best GPU to buy at every dollar level. Check it out, and we'll catch you on the next one.